The darling lady in the middle is Mrs. Lucy M. Harmon. She was my first and second grade teacher in the early 1960s. Her daughter, Dr. Marilyn Harmon, is on one side, and yours truly, still wearing his hall pass, Billy Sample, is on the other. I wish I could tell you that at ages 6 and 7 I was precocious enough to realize Mrs. Harmon's place in history and the history of the Civil Rights Movement. Unfortunately, I wasn't. Didn't discover her total impact on progressive society until decades later. Hopefully, it is not too late to highlight the accomplishments of this woman, who interacted with both the renowned scientist George Washington Carver, as well as Thurgood Marshall, the lead attorney for the landmark civil rights case Brown versus Board of Education, as well as 28 other successful civil rights cases argued before the Supreme Court, leading to his own appointment to the nation's highest judicial body in 1967, becoming the first African American to serve in that position. In 1920s Pulaski County, Virginia, public schools provided African American students with only a ninth grade education. Graduation from 12 grades depended on an appreciation of the importance of education and the means of providing the cost of private boarding schools, which fortunately Mrs. Harmon's father could provide. She and her brother attended Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and that's where she met the country's foremost scientist, botanist, inventor, and educator, George Washington Carver.
I did have the privilege of running into Dr. George Washington Carver, and that was great, but we used to laugh at him with them Kentucky jean pants on, and he'd come, we'd see him coming through the bottom.
Did he have his umbrella and suspenders
He
like we
always carried
pictured?
his umbrella, and we would tease him, especially. I would say to him, Dr. Carver, do you think it's going to rain today? You got your umbrella on, y'all. He said, well, in case it rains, I have it, and if the sun shines, I still have it. And we would laugh at him, and they said, he's going to get you straight one of these days. But he was always kind in talking back to you. He was always.
He didn't mind you teasing him about his dress, or
well, they
one time he was going to see
him.
the president, and
they teased him when he was going to see President Roosevelt, and he had these little high Kentucky jean pants on, and we said, Dr. Carver, you gonna buy a suit to go? And he said, they not looking at what's on my back, they're looking at what's in my head. No, I'm not buying any suit. I'm going just like I am. They said, well, you gonna wear them little Kentucky jean pants? He said, I'm going just like I am. He said, just like Dr. Washington used to say, buy a $50 pocketbook with 50 cents in it on a 50-cent head. And we laugh about that. You know, a lot of little witty things he would say. And he went on up to D.C., and they received him greatly. But he was great, and we enjoyed just being around him, you know, teasing him and so forth. But he was smart, and he taught us a lot of things.
Mrs. Harmon's interaction with Thurgood Marshall was initiated when she deftly discovered that there was a significant difference between the salaries of white and black teachers, thus bringing forth both equalization of salaries and equalization of facilities suits.
And so she said to me when we came out, oh, isn't it nice, we gonna get a raise? And I said, yeah, how much we gonna get? And she said, $120. Well, I wasn't getting but 60. And that's half of what Nanette talking about. And then the others, I knew they weren't getting but 55. So what I said to Mr. Gravely, now Gravely was one of the teachers there that's on our list,
right,
that's helped with the fight. I told Gravely, he said, well, I'm going to initiate the suit for equalization of salaries, while your husband initiates the one for equalization of facilities. And then that's when the suit started. After that, Mr. Gravely initiated, but they said we'll table this one, the one for salaries. And see, the NAACP took over, and that's where Thurgood Marshall finished that year at Howard University. That was his first year out. And he was a counselor or something in education. And my husband wrote that he'd be a test case. And it's in his handwriting. And that's in the Library of Congress. My husband Now that's in Dr. Tripp's book. And it'll tell you. And I said, Dr. Tripp, how did you feel when you got, he said, I said, did you feel like shouting when you saw that in the Library of Congress? He said, I didn't know whether to shout or to cry. He said, but I was mighty happy to see, and it was his handwriting, where he was asking, telling Thurgood Marshall that he would be a test case for the NAACP.
Could you tell us about your interaction with Thurgood Marshall?
Well, now, Thurgood Marshall came there, and he was with Hugh and Spotswood Robinson and those. They went down to the school board and asked the school board for the records. We were surprised. The school board went right to the desk and handed it right to them. But now Thurgood stayed in my home. My mother-in-law ran a boarding house, and it was the only boarding house that they had. Many times people came to that boarding house and never left it. They'd stay there forever. Many of them stayed there, sometimes 25 and 30 years, and sometimes all the life.
Ms. Harmon, when Thurgood was there at your mother-in-law's boarding house, when you talked about the suits that were pending, did you have to keep those hush-hush, or did people know about them? Did you have to keep those quiet? Or?
Well, we had to more or less, some of the teachers, you couldn't trust some, only 5 of us helped with the suit. The others, we were scared to even let them know what we were going to do. Because they'd go tell somebody or talk about it in the kitchen somewhere, and then it would get back to the school board. So you had to be quiet on everything that you did. You had to be silent so that the information wouldn't get back. And then that way we were able to get the suit going with the 5 of us heading it. And with Spotswood Robinson, Hewen, and Thurgood Marshall being our lawyers, we were able to do it.
Shortly after the initiation of equalization suits, Calfee Training School, where Miss Lucy Martin attended as a student and later as a member of the teaching body, burned completely to the ground. The principal and later husband of Miss Martin, Chauncey D. Harmon, lamented to the school board about its inactivity in finding a replacement dwelling for the African American students by citing the patience of the black community in dealing with the inadequacy of the previous structure. Our old building, although it was unfit to be called a schoolhouse, was accepted by us without a complaint on the strength of promises made to us for a number of years. And despite the fact that there were no water pressure maintained in the toilets, and they had to be flushed by buckets of water, that the radiators leaked so fast a bucket and a mop had to be kept by the 2 of them, that students had to double up to keep the water from leaking through the ceiling on them, that students were tripping over holes in the floor, and that we had no decent grounds for recreation, and our classrooms were horribly crowded. We took it all, hoping some of the promises would be kept. Mr. Harmon would lose his principal's job in Pulaski, but a couple of years later, after a series of odd jobs, would move with Mrs. Harmon to nearby Wythe County, where black teachers would receive equalization in pay, $120 a month. A few years later, the Harmons would become principal and teacher at George Washington Carver School in Salem, Virginia, and this is where our paths would cross. Though the conditions at Carver were much better than the old Calfee School, I knew at a young age that 50 students in Mrs. Saunders' 4th grade class was a bit much. In spite of Principal Harmon's pride with the Grade A oak basketball floor, which is still in superb shape, I might add, the dimensions of this court were too small when I played intermediate school ball after integration. Imagine the years of segregated black high school players playing home games on a court that is 70 by 38, 288 square feet smaller than the regulation 94 by 50 basketball court dimensions. As much as the size of the basketball court is a burr in my saddle, it pales in comparison to some of the scratch-your-head situations Mrs. Harmon endured. Here she describes one of my favorite poignant moments.
Well, now, my daddy would, sometimes if the road was real bad, he would come in from work, and then he'd say, I'm going to put a log and drag it to the highway, and the little white children and all of us would meet there at my house, and we would walk behind my daddy to the highway. And when we got to the highway, they would go and get on a bus, and we had to walk to 4 miles. We didn't have a bus. Never had a bus during the whole time I was from grade 1 to grade 9. Never rode a school bus to school. Had to walk it all those years. But the white children, now we all came out of the same era together. My daddy had made a path for us to come down. In the snow now, I'm talking about snow. And we get to the highway, take those old hemp sacks off our legs, shake the snow out and stick them in the mailbox. The mailboxes come along the highway there. And then they would go on down to McAdam, pick up some kids, and come back, and the children, they'd wave out at us, and we would be going up the highway, trying to beat that cold wind. It would be so cold sometimes. And we would still go, and we had to walk. We never had a bus. The children would wave out the bus and holler at us, and they said, it's a shame those children have to walk. And we sitting up here riding, and Mr. Martin had to make the highway for us. And so that was, you know, the way of getting to the school. We walked.
And years later, Mrs. Harmon's daughter, Marilyn, couldn't escape some of her own poignant moments.
Carver was a training ground for, I think, all of us, that we learned commitment. It was a foundation that education was the way out. And we grew up around here where things were segregated, clearly open with signs that let us know whites only. The restaurants we really couldn't go into, but we could go to, say, Brooksburg and get a snow cone or get something from the counter, but we couldn't sit.
That was the pharmacy.
That was the pharmacy. Mr. Bird was a very kind man and still is today, but he had to follow the law, and the law said we couldn't sit. And I always wanted to sit on one of those round stools that would spin around just to take a spin, but I never got to sit in those seats. But I could buy the snow cone, but we had to eat outside of the building.
Now, you look way too young to have experienced that. When you tell kids maybe that you have taught about things of that nature, if they've inquired about that, do they find it inconceivable that went on?
It seems to them as some far-fetched story. How could it be? Because that should have happened 100 years ago. But anyone 50 years old could be able to tell similar stories. The Lakeside Amusement Park, we could not go to. They would actually close Lakeside Labor Day and reopen it the next day for all black people to come from anywhere. My silent protest was, since I couldn't go the other days, I'm not going now. And when they did, they closed the pool, so the blacks couldn't go into the pool. So we saw those kinds of things that were just totally separate. Here in
fact, and recently they've had this situation up in Philadelphia where...
Yes, yes, same thing. Mm-hmm. And you would think we have come so far that that would be way back. And Carver being on this corner and Andrew Lewis on the next corner, one is all black, one is all white. And we had right across the street where Mrs. Davenport lived, she had a rooming house. And the farm team for the, I think they were Pittsburgh Pirates or one of the baseball teams, Lando Cepeda and some of the Cuban players.
You might have been the Giants at that point, but it was the Giants and then the Pirates.
All right. Then they would come and they would stay, and many of them were black. Now they could sit in restaurants.
Black Latins.
Black Latins. They could sit and sit down because they were considered guests of America. We were born here and couldn't sit down. So it was always, how strange is that? And I remember when we were growing up, and my mom didn't mention this, but teachers, my teachers were well prepared because many of them, most of them had masters. What the state of Virginia would do would be, since they couldn't go to Roanoke College or Hollins or Virginia Tech or Radford, they would pay them to go out of state to work on a master's, which sounds a little bit out of kilter. But my dad would go one summer to Columbia and leave. Mama would stay home with us. The next summer, she would go to Columbia. So the state they would pay her to go to Columbia with a stipend rather than to allow her to go to a state white school, college.
Would you have to prove that the state black school didn't have the curriculum that you did?
Yes, they would have to prove that Virginia State didn't have it. So they would just pick a class that they didn't have. And many of the teachers would go where they had families. So, of course, my mom and dad had sisters and brothers in New York. Someone else would choose to go to Iowa, Pittsburgh, and the state would pay for them when they could have walked up the street to Roanoke College.
Fighting through the injustices, you may be able to detect a strong theme of education as a way to enhance one's position in society. This was passed down from generation to generation in many families, with families like the Harmons at the forefront.
My daddy said, you gotta be smart. He said, no person is going to ever be president that's going to be lazy unless, he said, not if you're black. Well, not if you're colored, he said. You're not going to ever get anywhere. And you got to be doubly good if you're going to be anything, and therefore you must get an education.
This is just a sample of the 3.5 hours of Mrs. Harmon on tape that will elicit emotions from loud laughter to teary-eyed sympathy, such as how she was run over by a car on her first day of school, how a townsperson started a petition to keep the Harmons from buying a house near the white community, how a black woman walked 4 miles to nurse a white baby whose mother could not produce milk, and the effects of cows grazing on marijuana.
That whole big field was full of marijuana. And my mama used to say, now there's plenty teas down here to drink. Spicewood tea, Rasterane tea, sassafras tea, all these teas. But don't you ever get none of that weed out there. She said, because when the cows eat it, it makes them crazy. Well, you know, we didn't want to be crazy. So nobody ever bothered that marijuana. It just grew up all around us. So you see, you can be born and reared in something that's wrong, and you don't have to do it because it's wrong.
And much more. Yeah, I'm picturing a bovine with a cut of THC. If you are too, we may both be in need of professional help. Anyway, I want to selfishly and selflessly share Mrs. Harmon and her experiences with the world. I have some ideas for the big screen. If you'd like to assist, contact me, Billy Sample. Yeah, that's me in the background from years ago. Mrs. Harmon also taught me how to hit a hanging slider. Also, if you want to know in detail how the equalization of salaries and facilities continued the groundwork towards eliminating separate but equal via Brown versus Board of Education, as well as an overview of the public school history in the United States, read Chauncey Depew Harmon Sr., A Case Study in Leadership for Educational Opportunity and Equalization in Pulaski, Virginia, by Dr. N. Wayne Tripp, School of Education, Virginia Tech University. The face and sounds of our history.